It was a Thursday morning when the news hit the ticker. Ford Motor Company is relocating its entire EV truck production line to Canada. The announcement was blunt, tactical, and irreversible. Within minutes, the White House was in damage control. Cable news scrambled for statements. And somewhere inside Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump reportedly exploded in a profanity-laced tirade after learning that not only had Ford defied him, but Canada had blocked all outbound steel shipments to the United States in retaliation for his latest tariff threats. This wasn't just a policy disagreement anymore. This was industrial divorce. And the U.S. was the spouse getting left behind.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
A decade of decay, a week of collapse. The U.S. steel industry didn't collapse overnight, but its unraveling accelerated with Trump's 35% tariff policy in early 2025. Build America First. The tariffs were supposed to bring steel jobs roaring back. Instead, they did the opposite. Prices surged. Inventories dried up. Projects stalled. Small manufacturers, those without legal departments or lobbyists, began folding. Orders were canceled. Workers laid off. And construction companies faced price hikes that blew through budgets. Yet, while the Midwest hemorrhaged jobs, big players like Ford adapted. They did what any global corporation would. They rerouted by shifting procurement through Ontario, where steel remained competitively priced and outside U.S. tariffs. Ford maintained supply and avoided penalties. It was completely legal, completely predictable, and utterly devastating to Trump's narrative. When Canada saw the U.S. leaning on more tariffs, Carney responded by blocking outbound steel shipments to the U.S. entirely. It was surgical. It was strategic. And it exposed the myth of American leverage. Ford's exit, a corporate earthquake. Ford's decision to move EV truck production from Kentucky to Ontario was not impulsive. It was calculated, months in the making, and perfectly timed. Why? Because Ontario offered lower steel costs, no U.S. tariffs, stable interprovincial supply chain incentives, a rapidly expanding green energy grid to power production, a skilled, unionized workforce ready to scale, and most importantly, political and regulatory predictability. By the time Ford CEO announced a move, the die had already been cast. Hundreds of suppliers had signed Canadian contracts. Dozens of U.S.-based parts makers had already been offered relocation packages. Within a week, real estate around Oakville and Windsor skyrocketed. Local governments offered accelerated zoning permits. Canadian steel mills added shifts. Detroit, Louisville, Toledo, they were left to issue pink slips. Trump's tariffs backfired hard. Trump's response to Ford's relocation was textbook Trump. All-cap social media rage, fiery campaign rally meltdowns, and threats of patriotic boycotts. He declared Ford a traitor. He promised punishment through tax law. He even floated an idea for a 100% reentry tax on any vehicle made outside the U.S. But none of it stuck. Why? Because the damage had already been done. Ford wasn't the only one preparing a northern pivot. General Motors and Stellantis were reportedly in talks with Canadian suppliers within 72 hours of Ford's announcement. Canada's Trade and Industry Ministry leaked data showing $2.4 billion in new automotive investment commitments since the steel blockade. And provinces like Alberta and Quebec began fast-tracking approvals for rare earth mineral processing facilities to supply EV battery plants. Trump's tariffs weren't protecting U.S. industry. They were exporting it. The ripple effect in the Midwest, in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, where manufacturing had been holding on by a thread, the fallout was immediate. In Youngstown, an auto parts supplier laid off 230 workers. In Fort Wayne, a welding firm filed for bankruptcy. In Decatur, a steel components plant shut down after 68 years. And it wasn't just industrial workers. Truckers, warehouse operators, and maintenance crews saw hours slashed and contracts evaporate. The economic multiplier effect of Ford's exit hit like a freight train, with no brakes. Union leaders who once cautiously endorsed Trump in 2020 were now publicly disavowing him. AFL-CIO representatives called the tariffs economic malpractice. Even conservative governors began pushing back, urging Washington to reconsider the trade war before more plants disappeared. India, Brazil, and the shifting global steel order. As North America tore itself apart over steel, India and Brazil stepped in with grins. Both countries saw the vacuum created by U.S.-Canada tensions as a historic opening. Indian steel conglomerates like Tata ramped up exports to Europe and Africa, while Brazil's Gerdau expanded capacity and locked in supply agreements across Southeast Asia. By mid-2025, India became the number 2 global steel exporter, surpassing Japan. Brazil signed new bilateral steel trade agreements with Germany, the UK, and Nigeria. Southeast Asian countries began ditching North American suppliers in favor of emerging market steel. Cheaper, faster, and tariff-free. The U.S., it was losing market share fast. Worse, the International Monetary Fund issued a stern warning. If North American protectionism continues, the region could lose its competitive edge permanently in sectors like construction, aerospace, and infrastructure. Canada's strategic ascent. While Trump fumed and factories closed, Canada was building. With the One Canadian Economy Act in full force, provinces eliminated internal trade barriers, opened up interprovincial resource pipelines, and accelerated port expansions. Prince Rupert, Halifax, and Montreal saw record cargo volumes as new supply lines skipped U.S. bottlenecks entirely. Foreign investors, once wary of Canada's proximity to U.S. economic chaos, now saw it as a stable, rules-based market with global reach. Canada's steel, aluminum, and auto sectors were booming, not because they were protected, but because they were predictable. In short, Canada became the safer bet, the new North American trade order. What emerges from this chaos is not just a realigned supply chain, but a redefined economic map. The U.S., once the gravity center of North American manufacturing, is becoming a hostile environment for global business. Its tariffs were supposed to force companies home. Instead, they're forcing them away. Canada, by contrast, plays a long game, strategic diplomacy, infrastructure investment, sectoral support without micromanagement. And now, with Ford leading the way, the industrial North is being rebuilt without U.S. permission. Final thought, was it worth it? Trump promised to bring jobs back. He promised to punish offshoring. He promised tariffs would fix it all. But here's what really happened. American companies left anyway. Foreign markets filled the gap. Workers lost their livelihoods. Canada rose as a new industrial hub. The truth is, you can't legislate economic gravity. You can't bully a global economy into compliance. And you certainly can't stop an industry from moving where it makes sense. Trump picked a fight with a trade partner. Carney built an economy without him. And Ford? Ford chose Canada. Because smart companies follow logic, not loud voices. When Donald Trump returned to the Oval Office in 2025, he promised a second term would be about finishing the job. He declared that his steel tariffs would revitalize the Rust Belt, bring back the golden age of American manufacturing, and end the outsourcing betrayal. But reality didn't care about slogans. Steel prices ballooned. Construction projects froze. Exporters lost foreign contracts. And now, even the very companies Trump claimed to defend have had enough. Ford's decision to move production to Canada wasn't the first betrayal of the America First doctrine, but it was the most public, the most symbolic, and the most damning. Because when you lose Detroit, you lose the whole industrial heart. U.S. unions turn on Trump. The auto worker vote was pivotal in Trump's 2016 win, and even more critical in his 2020 near miss. But by 2025, the labor base that once tentatively embraced Trumpism had soured on its promises. After Ford's announcement, the United Auto Workers released a brutal statement. You can't slap 35% tariffs on your trading partners, jack up the price of raw materials, and expect companies to stay put. Trump's policies are why these jobs are gone. Period. This wasn't just a press release. It was a declaration of war from the very people Trump claimed to fight for. From Toledo to Dayton to Flint, union halls became war rooms. Organizers mobilized. Strikes spread. Retirees began showing up to town halls demanding answers. And Trump's talking points? They were drowned out by reality. Carney's move, blockade, build balance. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, always calm under pressure, didn't need a fiery speech or photo op to retaliate. He used policy. With one signature, Canada blocked the export of all critical steel, aluminum, and battery minerals to the U.S., citing national interest and economic security. But he didn't stop there. He announced a $7 billion infrastructure program focused on port expansion, rail modernization, and domestic EV incentives, all with the stipulation that projects use only Canadian or allied materials. The message to Trump was crystal clear. If you want a trade war, fine, but Canada will win it with strategy, not bluster. Emerging alliances, Canada, Europe, and beyond. The steel war may have started in North America, but the shock waves were global. Within weeks of Ford's move, Canadian ministers signed a new steel and auto technology memorandum with the EU, allowing seamless tariff-free exports of jointly certified goods. Even more dramatic, India and South Korea signaled interest in a trilateral agreement with Canada to share critical minerals, manufacturing inputs, and green infrastructure technologies. In a span of months, Canada went from being cornered by U.S. trade aggression to leading a new coalition of industrial partners, bypassing American influence altogether. Meanwhile, U.S. diplomats struggled to contain the fallout, watching as country after country sought alternate supply chains that excluded volatile U.S. policy environments. The supply chain map redrawn. Before 2025, most analysts considered the North American Industrial Triangle, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, irreplaceable. But with the U.S. choosing protectionism, that triangle became a line, a corridor. The Northern Corridor, running from Prince Rupert in British Columbia to Mazatlan in Mexico, became the backbone of a new trade architecture. Notably, it bypasses U.S. customs entirely. Companies began rerouting not just steel and auto parts, but green tech, lithium, aluminum, and semiconductors through this corridor, saving money, avoiding tariffs, and sheltering their operations from American instability. This shift is more than logistical. It's ideological. CEOs, investors, and governments are betting on calm, rules-based systems, not governments that govern by tweet. Small U.S. manufacturers, the collateral damage. While Ford escaped by investing in Canada, thousands of smaller American manufacturers didn't have that option. These companies, making fasteners, frames, wires, custom steel parts, couldn't absorb a 40% cost increase in steel. They couldn't reroute, and they couldn't relocate overnight. As a result, layoffs piled up in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. One factory manager in Akron put it bluntly, "We voted for Trump because he said he'd protect us. But now we're paying 3 times what we used for steel. We're not protected, we're punished." The Biden-era resilience funds had expired. The Trump administration subsidies were too little, too late. And the damage? It was baked in. The death of the American exceptionalism myth. At the root of this collapse lies a painful realization. American exceptionalism doesn't guarantee economic dominance. In today's world, countries that invest in stability, infrastructure, and diplomacy win. Countries that weaponize tariffs, alienate allies, and gamble with their own supply chains lose. Trump's mistake wasn't just policy. It was hubris. The belief that the U.S. was too big to suffer consequences, that it could demand and dictate, and the world would comply. But Canada didn't bow. Europe didn't cave. Asia didn't wait. And now, the U.S. finds itself isolated, outmaneuvered, and desperately trying to keep companies like Boeing and Ford from jumping ship. Green steel, blue collars, and red flags. In Carney's Canada, the future isn't just about retaliation. It's about reinvention. Steel mills are being upgraded to produce low-emission green steel, giving Canada a lead in the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. Battery plants are being co-financed with Germany and Japan. And vocational training is ramping up for the next generation of skilled trade workers. Meanwhile, in the U.S., tariff walls are crumbling faster than they're being built. No national climate strategy. No long-term industrial policy. Just tariffs, tweets, and temporary outrage. As one economist quipped, Canada is building a future. The U.S. is burning a grudge. Conclusion: who's really winning? By every measurable indicator, investment, trade flow, manufacturing output, geopolitical alliances, Canada is winning this trade war, not because it wanted one, but because it prepared for it. Trump's gamble to use steel as a political weapon backfired spectacularly. Ford left, supply chains shifted, allies drifted, and America's industrial future was handed over on a silver, tariff-free platter. To the very partners Trump tried to strong-arm, the image is stark. Trump screaming from a podium, red-faced and defiant. Carney behind the scenes, calmly orchestrating a 21st century industrial realignment. One man waving a fist, the other moving entire economies. And as Ford trucks roll off new Canadian assembly lines, destined for a world beyond the reach of U.S. tariffs, the question is no longer why this happened. The question is, how does America recover from this? Because Canada isn't looking back. It's building forward, without permission, without apology, and without Washington. It's the most devastating kind of victory, the one that happens quietly. While Trump's America flailed through tariff ultimatums and threats of economic decoupling, Canada methodically positioned itself as the industrial backbone of a new, diversified North American economy. This wasn't done with headlines or bluster. It was done through policy precision, coordinated leadership, and unshakable understanding of long-term resilience. What Mark Carney executed, with support from leaders like Chrystia Freeland and François-Philippe Champagne, was a textbook response to economic coercion. Strengthen from within, diversify abroad, and let your opponents unravel themselves. And that's exactly what happened. Trump's 2025 steel tariffs were meant to bring Canada to heel. Instead, they unleashed a cascade of domestic investment, fast-tracked infrastructure programs, and created what one Canadian economist described as the single greatest reshoring event in modern Canadian history. Made in Canada is back and stronger than ever. The Canadian government's new mandate, enacted through the One Canadian Economy Act, Bill C-5, delivered direct investment in domestic manufacturing, rail and port upgrades, and interprovincial trade standardization. But more than that, it restored a national industrial identity. No longer was Canadian steel viewed merely as a complement to American production. It became a badge of sovereignty, an economic line in the snow. From Hamilton to Sault Ste. Marie, factories that were once on life support receive an adrenaline shot. In just 6 months, over 7,500 new manufacturing jobs were created, and the Canadian Steel Workers Union reported its highest membership growth in a decade. At the same time, firms like Bombardier and Magna International doubled down on homegrown supply chains, citing the volatility south of the border as an unacceptable operating risk. Canada, once seen as economically tethered to its neighbor, had become a destination, not a dependency. The U.S. Midwest, a region abandoned. Meanwhile, the story in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana took a grim turn. What began as a slow trickle of factory slowdowns quickly became a flood of layoffs. In Dayton, a steel parts manufacturer shut down after 47 years, citing tariff chaos and lost Canadian contracts. In Fort Wayne, a truck axle supplier slashed its workforce by 40%, unable to absorb the rising cost of imported billet steel. And in Detroit, once the symbol of American auto supremacy, workers watched helplessly as Ford equipment was loaded onto trains bound for Ontario. By mid-2025, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics had recorded 73,000 job losses in the Midwest manufacturing sector. But those were just numbers. What mattered were the families now wondering how they'd make mortgage payments, the grocery stores with fewer customers, the schools losing funding as tax bases collapsed. This wasn't economic strategy. It was industrial suicide, carried out in the name of political ego. Canada's steel blockade was more than a countermeasure. It was a declaration of independence. It marked the end of decades of asymmetrical trade politics, where Canada had to play the accommodating junior partner. With careful strategy and unwavering resolve, Mark Carney and his team did more than withstand Trump's tariffs. They turned them into fuel for national renewal. By blocking raw materials, protecting jobs, forging new alliances, and expanding into green technology, Canada redefined its economic future without asking permission. And while Trump rages from a podium about betrayal and trade deficits, the world keeps moving. Ford production lines now hum in Windsor. Green steel flows to Rotterdam. Canadian cargo moves unimpeded from Atlantic to Pacific. And workers across Canada know one thing for certain. They stood their ground, and they're building something that lasts. Trump may have started this fight, but Canada finished it with dignity, discipline, and steel.